This here will be my presentation on my work in theoretical physics that I've started for several years now, with the majority of the work here stemming from this book, my third book, Quasi-Dimensionality, an accidental blueprint of the Infinite Improbability Field. Majority of the work is going to stem from this material, while the rest of it will stem from my second book, Metaversal Decipherment, The Art of Meaning Mechanics. I don't have that on here right now, but I'll send the link post a link in my description. Well, the first part of the book, Quasi-Dimensionality, or an introduction to quasi-dimensionality, that originally started as a paper that I tried to have published within 2020. And they were on the verge of having it published. They said they found it interesting and wanted to know more. But when they asked for my affiliations and what have you, when they saw that I didn't have any affiliations, and they took that to mean that it's not worth it being published. But I continued with my work and realized that there was more to discover and release. So I continued with my work since then. So I'll show you what I mean by all this. Well, essentially, quasi-dimensionality involves using consciousness using consciousness as a means of affecting reality as a whole, affecting how dimensions form, which affecting dimensions will eventually affect reality as a whole. Let's start off with this. You have a two-dimensional shape, a square. You have two squares here. You look at one square and you look at another. The oscillations of looking at both squares back and forth, that oscillation will, if you move fast enough in your observation of both squares, as in rapidly looking at them back and forth quickly, which you're not doing consciously, but if it's done by any conscious agent, more so a subconscious, behavior of sorts, you're going to have the formation of a three-dimensional shape, a cube essentially, with these lines being the visual representation of what happens when observation involving blending these two shapes together leads to a new shape. So this right here, as I wrote, is the visual representation of two squares being seen one at a time, which then causes the distance between these squares to be tracked through this visual representation or the line. In other words, since the entire square is being seen at once, the corners which make up that square are essentially being tasked to work in tandem with each other to ensure that they connect with the corners which make up the other square, which you see here, the third dimensional shape being formed. Now you have here a four-dimensional shape being formed, otherwise known as a hypercube or tesseract. This cube right here and the outer cube, when oscillating in observation of it, leads to the blending of these shapes, which forms an additionally a new shape in its entirety, which you see here. This is the next portion of the presentation, manufactured continuity. Now, given the understanding that we have a quasi-dimensionality, if you take that and apply it to how animation works with each still frame, which is what this is, if you look at it on its own, a still frame of something, which when you oscillate these still frames together, it creates a new shape entirely. I'm going to call the oscillation effect frame rates for later reference. With each still frame leading to a sense of continuity between each one, if the likeness of the two closest frames are similar enough in form to bridge the gap within our minds as to how the differences between each frame can find whatever justification is needed for one to have in order for them to accept that these frames belong together. What we'll have with that could be the mechanics which enable the progression of dimensions, and with that, the formation of shapes as a whole, even though the formation of shapes through a progression of dimensions then causes a philosophical issue regarding the ontology of dimensions and how they tend to form, and also where they originated from, which in essence would cause one to see that if a cube can form by looking back and forth between two squares fast enough that the mind would create after image frames of both squares to then make sure that the gaps within our psyches are filled by doing so, then the formation of every shape, no matter the dimensions which make them, must contain within itself a plethora of additional frames which are oscillating at speeds meant to overwhelm our capacity to notice that frame by frame rendering process is even happening. Manufactured continuity and how it connects to animation and animation process is going to involve a wonderful effect regarding the nature of manipulating information, affecting particles and things of that sort. How information is better than particles, and how the editing of information then do shifting frames, adding frames and taking out frames, then leads to basically altering the nature of reality at the smallest scale, which we'll get into how so at a later point. Now we're going to get into dark matter, dark energy, shadow particles. Just like how the lines which connect one square to another to make a cube through the approach explained in the quasi-dimensionality portion of this presentation, so too does the nature of wavelengths and how they play in making dark energy and dark matter what they are. So for starters, instead of viewing wavelengths as just a visual conceptualization of the potential places that a particle can be found within space, it must help us to imagine that imagery of the wavelength is both a literal and figurative demonstration of the particle and the energy levels being inhabited by the particle, which is why, if the wavelength of a particle is designed to both track the probable places that a particle might find itself within space-time, and for it represent a map which would show the quantitative increasing and decreasing in the particle's energy levels, then maybe the wavelength is free to exist in layers, such as having a proportionate copy of that wavelength, albeit reduced in size so that it may fit within the initial wavelength of the particle, sort of like a fractalization of itself, where the same wavelength is surely to reappear with each instance that it is zoomed in on itself. This is what I believe to be the source of all dark matter and dark energy, or rather, the end result of the dark matter and dark energy formation process, which I'll get to how so at a later point. For if that's the case, then I reckon that the phenomenon known as quantum entanglement is something which doesn't actually occur within an instant, despite how it might appear from our perspective, but instead at speeds which exceed any predictable means of detection or even visual. If the switching of a particle's spin because it was entangled with another particle was brought on by having a wave within a wave, and waves far deeper than that match itself in frequency to a particle which exists somewhere else, as the high energy levels of a particle as tightly compressed in its wavelength as the wavelength in theory would then suggest a particle having the capacity to move at a rather fast rate, which isn't enough to pass the speed of light barrier, at least on its own it isn't. But the wavelength, many magnitudes pressurized from where the initial wavelength was in its energetic state, is left to symbolize the speed and oscillations between frame rates being reduced in real time, with both of these scenarios being reflective of things going on beneath the surface. Now, this is a visual of what I mean by that. The initial or main wavelength as you see here. This is what we would normally see a wavelength to be, the initial wavelength. And then you have the first layer of a shadow particle. The first layer. You have the second layer here within that, and then it'll continue on indefinitely. That's how shadow particles form and function. Black holes and how they impact the production of dark matter and dark energy. The purpose of black holes is to take the wavelengths which are present in all particles and compress them until they can become dense enough to become that which constitutes as dark matter and dark energy, with the difference between the two and matter and energy overall to stem from the amount of distance present with each wavelength of a particle, as the particle which possess wavelengths that are close together will end up being matter, while the opposite of that will cause a particle to become that of energy. Therefore, the reason for the undetectability of dark matter and dark energy is because wavelengths, which act like bands of a sort, are actually separated from each other, as in the space between each wavelength band is what allows for the wavelength of other particles to slip through them or not, being that it's the interference experienced by the wavelength of a particle brushing up against the wavelength of another particle, which causes the slowing down in velocity that a particle goes through, or the thing we call mass. For without that, particles would constantly be in the midst of moving at faster than light speeds, since light itself is made out of bands of wavelengths, but with there being greater distances between wavelengths than how it is for matter, and why light won't experience its speed being dragged down as much. Moreover, if light is able to move at the rate in which it does, while also having little to no visible effect on dark matter and dark energy, then maybe the reason that is so is because the compression of wavelengths brought on from black holes is in a sense making the bands of wavelengths within certain frequencies so tight that their ability to slip through the wavelengths of every non-dark particle, which also means having particles capable of moving at tachyonic speeds because of it. On top of that, similarly to how the Doppler effect causes the wavelength of sound to change in resonance to one's proximity to, in response to one's proximity to it, what one would call a force in physics, such as electromagnetic, strong and weak, gravity is really nothing more than the wavelength of a particle increasing enough in size the closer that it gets to another particle, that the bands of wavelengths which make up the particle are indeed forced, pun intended, to become influenced by the interference of wavelengths being made by each particle, meaning that a particle will host within itself an innumerable amount of wavelengths within a set area, the same way that the Poincare disk model has been shown to work. But what I also imagine is true is that the compression of wavelengths caused by the black hole is what leads to these particles eventually becoming the fractalized wavelengths, which are shadow particles, by way of attaching themselves to particles which aren't considered dark. When particles which operate outside the conventional flow of time are even able to do so, because the speed in which particles comprised of wavelengths too small to be detected or interfered with by other particles is essentially high enough to break the light travel barrier and move both backwards and forwards in time. The wavelength mechanics of quantum entanglement. With wavelengths having a particular amount of dips and rises to them, which includes the distance between those dips and rises being a major factor in determining the nature of a wave, it is also important to recognize that wavelengths can just as easily be defined by the wavelengths of the shadow particle, or at least parts of the wavelength of the shadow particle, could find itself overlapping with the core wavelength of any wavelength of a particle, independent of the level, so as to form a composite wavelength by taking a portion of the wavelengths within a particle that may allow for it to become the particle whose wavelength is in perfect resonance with the wavelength of a particle which is entirely different to itself, like a proton with a muon, for instance, as well as for future iterations of a particle to serve with making this work, which means that particles are meant to function as holders of their previous and eventual selves, with the latter kind of selves being accessed by increasing the wavelength proportions of the core or main wavelength, whose essence is indicative of the present moment, while the enlarged proportions of the wavelength must appear that way because of distance between the present moment and future one, as getting closer to that future moment in time for the particle will most certainly bring the size of the wavelength to one which is akin to how it was when the wavelength was first observed. Lastly, when it comes to how the state of resonance between particles is allowing for quantum entanglement to function, what one must realize is that the shift in spin which happens to a particle because the spin of another particle that is entangled with was altered for whatever reason is really the wavelength of a particle being repeated. And by that I mean reverberated across space-time as if it were an after-image of itself, with each after-image that it makes being what draws it closer to its intended target, which is the other particle that is entangled with, and how the information contained within that wavelength is telling the wavelength of the other particle to do as it is doing, to become exactly as it has been. Now what I mean by this is that with the initial wavelength here, the main wavelength, let's say the wavelength of an electron, because it's overlapping with itself, the shadow particle wavelength, the shadow wavelength of itself, this overlapping is going to fill in the gaps in such a way that it's going to become an entirely different particle through the effect of having parts of one band of wavelength become another part. So it's going to take this portion, cut off, and then take that other portion and add on to itself and become an entirely new wavelength. That composite wavelength will allow the wavelength of an electron to entangle itself, to resonate with the frequency of, let's say, a proton, a neutron, or any other particle. It allows for every particle to both be its own particle while also entangle itself to any other particle, because the wavelengths are all overlapping with itself and therefore allowing itself to match with any other particle, no matter the type, and as such, no matter the distance or point in time entirely. Superposition numbers. Having particles capable of existing beyond a domain that is time is without question bizarre, with the reason for such a thing to even happen to be because their ability to remain undetected from certain wavelengths, but not necessarily others, due to any wavelength, no matter how small, would eventually find its match in frequency, and how that resonance in frequency will only serve in enabling particles to become entangled with other particles, and without limit in the amount of particles or in the type, so as to have a photon entangle itself with the proton, if the shadow particle of the photon were to match in frequency with the proton, and vice versa. After all, if the wavelength of particles were to become so small in size, but not in power, that the force from it being that way would necessitate the use in mathematical equations, formulas, techniques, which rely on a different set of rules to them. Hence the superposition number, or what is known as the octonion within mathematics, which is actually just a number meant to mimic the behavior of particles which don't behave in accordance with conventional time. In other words, because shadow particles are able to both exist as the same particle that they are currently residing within and as a different particle altogether, because it's of a different temporal reality somewhere beyond our notion of time, their predictability is something which can't be followed using methods that most people are familiar with, and why using mathematics where any calculation made will only lead to the correct solution if having each particle entangle itself to every other particle will bring with it the possibility to have reality as we know it shifted in its entirety. The power of having superposition numbers where the value of a number is able to be multiple things at once, thereby allowing each number to become anything it wants to be within these conditions. Besides, if particles are able to entangle with every other particle with enough renditions of their initial wavelengths, just with the size of them being different to what they originally were upon first glance, which is based on seeing the deeper wavelengths from a distance, then it's likely that using numbers which act as if one were to contain the features of every other number is key to anticipating the nature of particles as elusive as those of the dark shadow variety. Now this here's my presentation. You have the links to both my books which elaborate on this even further, as well as add additional information that I didn't provide so far in the description. I'll have those links there. Hopefully you find something useful in what I presented so far, at least to pique your interest into learning more about this.